This young black girl told the police officer she was hungry. And what he did next left everyone speechless. The streets were bustling with the typical morning chaos, cars honking, people hustling from one place to the next, and the faint murmur of life continuing its course. But Maya wasn't part of it. Today, she stood on the edge of the world, unnoticed, hidden in plain sight. She sat on a cracked bench by the sidewalk, her jacket pulled tightly around her thin frame, the chill of the early morning air biting at her skin. Her stomach growled louder than the passing cars, a constant reminder that she hadn't eaten in hours. She was used to it by now, the goring hunger that never seemed to subside. It was part of her life, just another fact that she had learned to live with. But today, it felt different. The ache in her belly felt deeper, more insistent than ever before. For her hands trembled slightly as she tucked them into her sleeves, trying to warm up, but nothing could warm the hollow emptiness inside her. The world was moving fast around her, but Maya was standing still, caught in the quiet moments, where nothing seemed to matter, except the growing emptiness in her gut. It was always like this. She couldn't remember the last time she had a full meal, and it wasn't just the hunger for food. It was the hunger for something more, something that made her feel like she mattered. Her gaze fell to the ground, the weight of her thoughts pulling her deeper into herself. She wished for just one thing, a meal, something to quiet the pain in her body and the loneliness in her heart. But the reality was clear. There was no one to help her. No one to notice, no one to care. She sat in the silence for what felt like hours, lost in the discomfort of her own thoughts, until she heard the crunch of boots against the pavement. Maya's head snapped up her eyes, meeting the figure of a tall man walking down the street, a police officer. He passed by his boots, tapping rhythmically on the sidewalk, his face focused and determined. But then something unusual happened. He slowed his steps, looking over at her for a split second, a pause that felt like an eternity. Maya didn't know why she did it, but the words slipped out before she could stop them. "I'm hungry." The officer stopped in his tracks as if the words had stopped him. He turned his head, his eyes narrowing slightly as he took in her appearance. A young girl sitting alone in the cold, looking like she had seen more hardship than most could understand. He stood there for a moment, silent, and then, without warning, he walked back toward W. Maya's heart skipped a beat. She hadn't expected him to stop. She hadn't expected anyone to notice, but here he was, standing in front of her, his gaze thoughtful and steady. "What did you say?" he asked, his voice soft but firm, as if trying to make sense of the situation. "I'm hungry." Maya repeated, her voice quieter this time, as if the vulnerability of her words had suddenly caught up to her. She felt a lump form in her throat, but she swallowed it back. This wasn't the time to cry. She had to stay strong. The officer stood there for a few more seconds, his eyes scanning her face. He seemed to be processing something, but Maya couldn't figure out what. All she could think about was the fact that she had just admitted something she hadn't allowed herself to say out loud. For a long time, Maya's story wasn't like the ones you'd see on TV or read about in books. It wasn't filled with fairy tale endings or grand adventures. Her life had been one long struggle from the moment she was born, raised in a small, cramped apartment on the edge of town. Maya never knew what it felt like to have everything she needed. Her mom, a waitress at a local diner, worked long hours just to keep the lights on. But no matter how hard she worked, it was never enough. The bills piled up faster than they could be paid, and there was always one thing missing. Food. Maya had learned at a young age how to scrape by. She knew where the food banks were, where the shelters handed out meals. She knew the routine by heart. It wasn't just about getting food. It was about surviving her father. The man who was supposed to protect and provide for her had disappeared before she could even remember his face. Maya grew up with just her mom, and though her mom tried her best to make everything feel normal, Maya knew the truth. Life was hard, but life was harder when you didn't have anyone to depend on. Every day, Maya fought to maintain some sense of. Normally, she went to school, kept her grades up, and tried to make friends. But it was hard when you didn't have the things other kids took for granted. New clothes, a hot meal, a place to call home. It was hard to fit in. Most days, she kept to herself, not because she wanted to, but because she didn't want anyone to see how empty her stomach felt, or how she had to walk to school in shoes that were too small for her feet. The hunger was a constant companion. It wasn't just about missing a meal, it was about never knowing when you'd get to eat again. It was about never having enough to feel full bull. Some nights she'd lie awake listening to the rumble of her stomach, wondering if things would ever change. But Maya was resilient. She had to be. She knew that no one was coming to save her, that no one was going to fix her problems. She had learned how to get by on the little things, grabbing leftovers from the diner when no one was looking, finding change on the ground to buy a snack from the vending machine. It wasn't ideal, but it was all she had. She didn't talk about it. To her, admitting that she was hungry was a sign of weakness. It meant she couldn't take care of herself, couldn't manage her own survival. But today, in the quiet of the morning, she had said it aloud, and now, standing in front of her, was a man who had heard her, a police officer who, for reasons she couldn't understand, had taken her words seriously. The officer stood there for a moment, his gaze still fixed on Maya. He hadn't expected those words from her. He had walked this route 100 times, passed by 1,000 people, and never once had anyone admitted such a thing. People didn't say they were hungry out loud. They didn't need to. It was just a silent part of life that everyone carried. He took a slow breath, then crouched down in front of Maya, his face softening as he looked at her. "What's your name?" "Maya," she answered quietly, her eyes avoiding his gaze. She wasn't used to people asking about her. It was easier to stay in the background, unnoticed, invisible that way. No one had to ask the hard questions. "Maya," the officer repeated, his voice low and gentle. "How old are you?" "I'm 12, she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. The officer nodded, his mind working through the situation. A 12-year-old girl sitting on a bench in the cold, hungry, with no one around to help. It wasn't right. He had seen his fair share of difficult situations on the job, but this one hit him differently. This wasn't just another person on the street. This was a kid, someone who should have been at home eating breakfast, getting ready for school, not sitting alone on a bench, barely able to keep her eyes open because of hunger. "Do you have somewhere to go?" the officer asked, his voice carrying a note of concern. Maya shook her head slowly. "No," she whispered. "I don't." The officer's eyes flickered with understanding. She wasn't just hungry. She was alone, in a world that didn't seem to care about her or anyone like her. He had seen homelessness before, seen kids in foster care and shelters, but Maya was different. She was standing on the edge of something fragile, and he wasn't about to walk away without doing something, without thinking. Officer Ramirez reached for his radio, speaking to his partner. He was going to make sure Maya didn't have to go through this alone. After a few moments, he put the radio back in its holder and turned to her again. "I'm going to help you, Maya," he said. "I'm not going anywhere." Maya's eyes widened slightly for a brief moment. She couldn't believe what she was hearing. Help. What kind of help she had been let down so many times in her life that it was hard to even imagine someone coming through for her. "Are you serious?" she asked, her voice barely audible. Officer Ramirez nodded, his eyes unwavering. "Yes, I'm serious. I'm going to make sure you get something to eat. I'm going to make sure you don't go through this alone." Maya stared at him, trying to make sense of the words, but all she could focus on was the warmth in his voice, the sincerity in the way he spoke. He wasn't just offering a meal, he was offering something else, something she hadn't felt in a long time. Hope the officer knew he was crossing a line. It wasn't part of his job description to get involved in situations like this, to personally intervene in someone's life. His training had always been clear: call the proper authorities, get them to handle things, but something inside him told him this wasn't just another case. This was a child in need, and he couldn't just walk away. He glanced around. The streets were still full of people rushing to work, going about their daily routines. No one seemed to notice Maya sitting there. The hunger in her eyes, the way her body seemed to slump with each passing minute. It was as if she had become a ghost, blending into the background of a world that didn't care. Officer Ramirez felt a heavy weight settle in his chest. He had seen people go through hardships, seen the effects of poverty and neglect. But this was different. This was a girl alone, struggling to survive in a world that didn't care. His heart ached for her, but he also knew that helping her in the moment, giving her a meal, was just a temporary solution. It wasn't going to fix her situation. It wouldn't solve the deeper issues of her life. The lack of stability, the absence of a support system, the feeling of being invisible. He didn't have the power to change all of that in one moment. Still, something inside him refused to let go. He couldn't just stand by and do nothing. Maya watched in disbelief as Officer Ramirez stood there, his hand on his radio, waiting for a response. She could see the wheels turning in his mind, and the longer she stared, the more she realized that he wasn't just going through the motions, he actually cared. This wasn't some routine call or a standard procedure. This was a real person who was going out of his way to help another real person. And for Maya, it was more than just a meal. It was a gesture she hadn't seen in years. She didn't know how to respond. A part of her was still skeptical. How could someone just offer help like that without expecting something in return? Her whole life had been built on the belief that nothing came without a price. But this officer wasn't asking for anything. He was simply offering something she desperately needed. Minutes later, Officer Ramirez gestured for her to follow him, and without thinking, Maya stood up and followed. They walked a short distance to a nearby cafe, a small local place that had a comforting warmth and the smell of freshly brewed coffee wafting in the air. The interior was cozy, with the clatter of plates and quiet chatter of people filling the space. The officer approached the counter and spoke briefly to the barista, ordering a meal and a drink. Maya stood quietly by his side, feeling awkward and out of place. She had never been inside a cafe like this before. It wasn't the kind of place someone like her usually visited. She was used to the corner stores, the fast food joints, places where the people behind the counter didn't care about who you were or where you came from. But here it was different. The barista smiled as he handed over the meal, a warm bowl of soup and a sandwich, along with a bottle of water. Officer Ramirez turned back to Maya, handing her the meal. "Here you go," he said, his voice gentle but firm. "Eat, you deserve it for a moment." Maya hesitated. Her hands trembled as she reached for the food. It had been so long since she had felt the warmth of a meal, the simple comfort of food in her stomach. She sat down at the small table, her eyes wide as she looked at the meal in front of her. It was more than she had ever hoped for. In that moment, more than just the food itself, it was someone caring enough to stop to see her as more than just another face in the crowd with trembling hands. Maya picked up the spoon and took a bite of the soup. The warmth spread through her, and for the first time in what felt like forever, she felt a sense of relief. The hunger was no longer overwhelming her, and she allowed herself to close her eyes for a moment, savoring the comfort of the meal officer. Ramirez watched her silently, his own thoughts racing. He had been a cop for years, but today he realized something he had never truly understood. Before the power of small acts of kindness, he had helped people in the past, had responded to countless calls. But there was something different about this moment, something raw, something human. He could see the way Maya's shoulders relaxed, the way the tension in her face eased. It wasn't just the food. It was the fact that someone had cared enough to see her to take the time to ask to step in when no one else had. As Maya finished the soup, she looked up at Officer Ramirez, her eyes meeting his for the first time. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice small but filled with gratitude. The officer smiled back a smile that didn't just show his teeth, but spoke of something deeper, a recognition of the human connection between them. "No need to thank me," he said. "I'm just doing what anyone should do." But Maya wasn't sure she believed him. She had been on her own for so long that it felt strange to hear someone say such a thing. But in that moment, she understood this wasn't just about a meal. It was about something bigger. It was about a person seeing her, hearing her, and offering help when it wasn't expected, and that she realized meant everything. Just as Maya began to finish the last bite of her meal, something unexpected happened. The door to the cafe opened, and a man stepped inside, his eyes scanning the room before they landed on Officer Ramirez and Maya. He looked like he was in a hurry, his clothes a bit disheveled, but there was something about his demeanor that suggested he was no stranger to the community. He walked straight toward the officer, and Maya watched. As they exchanged a few quiet words, she could tell that this wasn't just a casual conversation. There was something urgent in the way they spoke. As the officer stood up, he turned back to Maya. "I need to step out for a moment, but I'll be right back. You stay here, okay?" Maya nodded, a little confused, but trusting him, she wasn't used to anyone leaving her alone and coming back. But there was something different about the officer. She felt like he wouldn't just disappear. The man who had walked in it turned out was a local community organizer. His name was Tom, and he had been following Officer Rear as his interactions with the public for some time. When he saw the officer's act of kindness toward Mir, something clicked for him. He had been trying to get local businesses and organizations involved in helping kids in need. Kids like Maya, who were often overlooked, forgotten by the very systems that should have been supporting them. Tom and Officer Ramirez spoke for a while, and by the time the officer returned to Maya, things had changed. He sat back down across from her, his face serious but hopeful. "Maya," he began, "I want to let you know that this is just the beginning. There are people in this community who care, who want to help. We're going to make sure you're not alone. You're going to be okay." Maya looked up at him, her eyes wide with surprise. She had never heard those words before, not from anyone. But Officer Ramirez wasn't finished. He looked over his shoulder at Tom, who was now talking to the cafe owner about creating a support system for kids like Maya, offering meals, resources, and a safe place to go. "Things are going to change for you," the officer said softly. "There's a lot of good in this world, and I'm going to make sure you're a part of it." For the first time in a long time. Maya felt a flicker of hope. She wasn't just being helped in the moment, She was being seen as someone worth investing in, someone who mattered. It was a feeling she hadn't felt in years, and it was enough to make her believe that maybe, just maybe, her life could be different from what she had always known. As the days passed, Maya's life began to change. Officer Ramirez and Tom worked together to connect her with local resources, food, shelter, mentorship. It was a network of support that Maya had never imagined could exist for her. But it did, and she wasn't alone anymore. The cafe, which had been the backdrop for one pivotal moment in her life, became a place of warmth and belonging. Other kids who were in situations like Maya's found their way there too. They shared stories, meals, and support, all under the watchful eye of a community that finally cared. Maya never forgot that day, the day she admitted she was hungry, and a stranger didn't just pass by, he stopped, listened, and changed her life. As for Officer Ramirez, he learned something important that day too, that sometimes the smallest acts of kindness can have the biggest impact, and that in a world that often forgets about people like Maya, it only takes one person to make a difference. So the next time you see someone in need, remember Maya's story. Sometimes all it takes is one act of kindness to turn someone's world around. And Maya, well, she wasn't invisible anymore. She was seen, she was heard, and most importantly, she knew she was not alone.